About a year ago, those of us on the Oakland County Historical Commission met at our chairman's house for a little Christmas party. And while sitting there, part of what we were talking about was what we might do as a commission to honor Oakland County's bicentennial, which starts in 2020. Dave Walls, who was one of the other commissioners, and I were sitting there talking, and as it turns out, he had just gotten this book, which is a reprint, library-bound reprint of the 1877 History of Oakland County, done by L.H. Everett's Publishing Company. And so we got talking, and Dave and I thought it would be a really good idea if maybe we acquired enough of these books that we could give them out to all the libraries in the county. Many libraries actually have this book, but they have an original. And the problems with the originals is they themselves are historical records. They're fragile, they're typically locked up. You can't use them unless the librarian is looking over your shoulder and not using, making sure you don't have a magic marker or ripping pages or something like that. So our thought was that something like this, that's library quality binding, that it costs a few bucks, but it's not, $500 it would take to replace one of those original books. So there's no harm in having the great unwashed handle this, right? And so that's what we did. We wound up acquiring enough books to distribute to all of the libraries in Oakland County and a number of the historical societies. And so what I would like to do is to present to Tiffany this book from the Oakland County Historical Commission to Rochester Hills Public Library. Thank you very much. There you go.
Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. While we're on the bicentennial, there are a couple of commissioners present here tonight, and we have been involved in producing a little history of Oakland County, and this is the first night this has been available. So we have about 10 copies in the back of the room. Maybe there's 11 with this one, so if you don't get one of the 10, race up here and get the 11th, which will be sitting up here. But it's a little history of Oakland County that you might find interesting. Okay. They are for you. Gifts. Absolutely flat out gifts.
But there's only 11.
There will be more. There are more. But only 11 were brought here because the messenger is old and feeble and can only carry 11.
He could probably carry some more if there was a great demand, because we only have 1,000 until we go to the second tree. So, not a donation.
Take what you want. Come to another presentation that I do. I just can't say no. All right. So the book is presented, and what this talk is going to be is a bit about the book, but a bit about the history of Oakland County and a bit about the history of the United States at the same time. So that's kind of what we're going to do tonight, is to talk about the history of Oakland County, a little bit of the history of the United States, and bleed all that in, and where it connects with this book. The book itself is, of course, available in the library, but it's also available online. So you can, go take and peruse this thing in a variety of different ways. The book itself was published in 1877. It really was part of kind of a nationwide kind of phenomenon, I guess, of the publication of the printing and writing of probably in the neighborhood of 1,000 at least, probably as many as 1,500 county histories, very similar to this, that were produced in the years between 1875 and 1885. Michigan had about 110, according to one bibliographer, it's about 110 county histories that had been produced. 40 of those county histories were written in this period between 1885 or 1875 and 1885. There was quite a rush all over the country. The primary catalyst for this, there's really two. The first big spark seems to be the centennial celebration in 1876 honoring the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And as this book, as we are passing out a copy of this book for the Oakland County Bicentennial, it was written kind of in commemoration of the nation's centennial. It's a fairly common thing for organizations to do, is produce these histories at those kind of celebratory times. So the centennial was one of the catalysts for this. But the base of all of this, I think, was the fact that most of these county histories were written in states, in counties west of the Appalachians. That area of the United States was all settled initially in that first great wave of settlement running from roughly 1800 to about 1840. And that gets you across the Mississippi River. And everything's settled by that time. Well, the people who were about a part of that settlement that came west in the very early days, they're now starting to die very rapidly. And there aren't many of them left by 1877. And so much like Tom Brokaw wrote about the Greatest Generation and the rush to kind of get the histories of the World War II veterans covered before they passed from the scene, so too this book was written as an effort to preserve the memory of those pioneers that came west in the 1820s and 1830s and 1840s. And the same sort of thing is happening in state after state across the United States. And that's why there's this great flurry of activity to get these books produced in the 1870s and 1880s. And this gives you this is from one of the people who's covered in the book. In recalling these instances of pioneer days, a great many of which have passed from my mind, I seem as it were to be living them over again, and I rejoice to know that steps are being taken to preserve a record of them, which, if not done, will soon be among the things of the past and be forgotten forever. You're going to see quotes like this throughout the book of these old pioneers kind of essentially rejoicing with the fact that somebody's taking the time to collect their memories. Now, the problem with this is, there's, as I say, somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,500 of these books. These are massive undertakings. This particular book has something like 300,000 words in it. The Bible has 800,000, right? This is a big book. And it was cranked out in less than 6 months. The Everett's Company showed up in the spring of 1877, and by October, they're saying, you better hurry up and get your book because there aren't that many left. It's a massive undertaking. So the question is, how in the world are they going to get that much done in that short a period of time and do it in 1,500 counties across the United States? Now, it wasn't just Everett's Company. There were a number of publishing companies like Everett's that were doing this. But Everett's is one of the companies, one of a number of publishing companies that were engaged in this activity. The way they were able to pull this off basically is essentially the authors of this book were less authors than they were editors. They were calling on local people to actually produce a lot of the words that are in this book. They would send out requests to, the ministers in the county, to the lawyers in the county, to government officials in the county, to local dignitaries, and ask them to write up something that they were familiar with. A lot of the book and most of these books consist of biographies of reasonably notable individuals in the community. Well, pay us a few bucks and we'll put your biography in the book, but you write it. And so they got some money for including the biography, and then they got somebody to write the book or write the biography. So people were writing kind of their own biographies, or written by a lot of the people in the book. They're dead when their biography appears in here, but a relative or a friend or something wrote the biography. So the authors of the book didn't do anywhere near all of the writing. They did all the editing, but they certainly didn't do all of the writing. And then the lithographs in the book, of the farmsteads, I'm sure that all of you are familiar with, those lithographs were hand-drawn by artists of Everett's, and then they were converted to lithographs. But the pictures that are in the books of the individuals, those were photographs that they'd have to turn into Everett's, and then Everett's would convert them into lithographs for inclusion in the book. Again, if you want that lithograph of your farmstead in the book, you're going to have to pay extra for it. If you want a photograph of you and your wife or whatever, you're going to have to pay extra for that. But that's how they gathered a lot of this material. Another thing they did, and this is, again, Dave Wall's going out and doing a lot of research, digging through some of the early newspapers, found in the Pontiac Gazette and a couple other papers, a list of questions that were published, and essentially people were asked to respond to these questions. So, and that makes up a large part of the material that's in the book. So this very list, not quite in those words, shows up in the Pontiac Gazette and other Pontiac newspapers several times in the spring of 1877. L.H. Everett's and Company, who are awaiting a history of Oakland County, who are preparing a history of Oakland County, are gathering material of every nature from which to make up the records. And Mr. Samuel W. Durant, a business and genial gentleman, and who is the chief historical writer for the work, is now in the city looking after material in this locality. Mr. Durant is stopping at the Hodges house. There's a picture of the Hodges house that's in the book. And those who are in possession of facts connected with the personal or material history of the county should put him in possession of them. That's in May of 1877. Okay. Durant was the principal author of this book, or should I say editor, and he's assisted by a guy by the name of Henry Pierce. The two of them worked together on several other of these county histories. Durant himself seems to have been the principal author, editor / editor of at least 8 books like this. Some of them in New York, some of them in Michigan. And Pierce worked on at least 4 or 5. And I think most of them in partnership with Durant. The book itself is broken into 3 sections. The first 50 pages or so is kind of a general history of Oakland County, and it is original writing by Durant and or Pierce. The resources are county records, township records, state records, and then secondary sources of one kind or another. And it gives kind of a general layout of the geography of Oakland County, the history of Oakland County, the history of the Great Lakes area, relevant American history, and then it finishes off, as many of these sections do, or many bits in the book will do, with great long lists of elected officials. So, everybody who was ever a representative from Oakland County is in the book, and who was ever a representative in the state of Michigan is in the book. This is a great long list of names. That's the first part. Then the second part, and the most substantial part of the book, the most important part of the book, is really these township histories. Oakland County has 25 townships, and each township has essentially a chapter in it. And the material there is gathered from the townships themselves, the answers to these questionnaires, and then to the other material that was collected by Durant at the Hodges house that was written by somebody else in many cases. And then the back of the book contains military records, including a list of all of the Oakland County soldiers and what regiments they served in the War of the Rebellion. This is never referred to as a civil war or the war between the states. It's the rebellion. Sometimes the slaveholders' rebellion. Okay. Just the terminology tells you a little bit about who people's heads were at that time. So those are the 3 main sections. What's most important to us is really these township histories. Each of these townships are kind of laid out more or less like this. It's not precise. It varies a bit from township to township. But as you can just take a look at this, it follows those questions. So the questions wind up being formulated in this kind of a rough outline, and then that's what each township history is about. And then that's supplemented if you have a village or a town in your particular township, then there will be a separate section on that particular town. So in Avon Township, Rochester shows up as having its own little section, but it's basically the same kind of a layout. And then in all of these, there's a number of biographies in each township history. Here we have the Button family, a very happy couple, as you can see. And they're kind of typical of the kind of images you're going to get. And then there's a little story about the Buttons. Mostly, it's pretty male-centric. This is a pretty patriarchal publication. Most of the characters in here they're talking about are men. Women do show up. All the pictures, it's always the man and the woman, the spouse. They're always there, and there's some histories of some of the women. Mostly there's a little bit of their history, but again, it's pretty patriarchal. And then these are the kinds of things that are in those bios. When you read this book, make sure you look at the bios. The bios have a lot of really good information in them that you need to look at and incorporate. It's not something to skip through. A lot of the detail that you're going to get from the book is going to come from those bios. Now, one of the questions that we kind of confronted early on the commission is, well, yeah, but this isn't really great history. This book is not great history. In fact, it's primarily a book that's written to commemorate the pioneers. It's not a comprehensive history of Oakland County at all. The material is not terribly well integrated. The authors, the editors put this material in a pretty logical way. They put it all in one voice. It's quite readable, but there's not a lot of challenging of the facts that are produced by the local historians. Okay? They're given material, they organize it, and they print it. They aren't being terribly critical of the facts that they're being given. The other thing that's important to recognize here is that this is basically oral history. There are some sections that are taken from township records and so on, but most of this is in effect oral history. And if you know anything about oral history, you know that it's just not all that reliable. As you can imagine, tell me about what you were doing 40 years ago. And let's have a debate as to how accurate that's going to be. So you have just memory problems. You have perception problems. Boy, over time, people start to believe that this is what the big issue was back 30 years ago, and that's how they remember it. And then you're certainly going to have people that have a particular agenda when they tell oral histories. So individually, a lot of this stuff you can kind of look at very, very critically and say, well, wait a minute, this isn't very good history. But the thing about oral histories is that in mass, when you get, there's a couple of hundred, several hundred essentially oral histories in this book. And when you look at enough of them, you start to pick up patterns. Whether or not an individual oral history is accurate, they never are. Okay? They're always inaccurate. But there's a safety in numbers here. When you start to see the same sort of thing popping up in history, in biography after biography, in history after history of these individual sections, you can start to get some very nice generalizations that you can make about what life was like in Oakland County for these people. And then the other thing about these oral histories is they're just flat out fun to read. They're very entertaining, and reading some of these stories is, again, just flat out fun. But then when you start to look at a bunch of them and look at the general patterns of what's being described here, this winds up being, it may not be great history, but it is great raw material for history. Okay, it's not quite primary source material, but it's close. Okay, so you can get a lot out of these books. My view on history is that it is a mosaic. When you step back, you see American history or European history or whatever. You step back and you see American history. And then up close, you see local history. The problem that I have and a lot of us on the commission have is that local history tends to be just this. You're up close looking at that great detail, but without stepping back, you miss the picture. The Everett's book is flat out local history. You don't get, especially in the township sections, they're not stepping back. looking at the big picture of what's going on in America, what's going on in Michigan, in these township histories at all. It's all this. It's all up close and personal. Great stories. But what the heck's it mean? You know? You have to step back, I think, in any local history and kind of understand, put it in the context of the bigger picture. Otherwise, the value of that local history is diminished. When you look at oral history, or local history rather, if you can put it in the context of the big picture, you're going to get a much greater meaning of what that local history is all about. And I think there's kind of two perspectives you can take here. One is that American history is simply the sum total of thousands of local histories. And that is a perfectly appropriate view to take. Then there's a reverse side to that. The local history is simply the local manifestation of national history. That too is a perfectly valid view to take. I think you take both of those and you put it together when you start to look at local history. But you have to do it, again, to some extent in the context of this big picture. And that's one of the things that I want to try and do tonight, is to talk about the book, but talk about it in the context of what's going on in the bigger picture. The book itself doesn't do any of this. It's all local history. Great stuff. But in order to get maximum value from the book, you need to kind of understand the context of what's going on. So the book is written in 1877. The action takes place essentially from 1817, 1818 up to 1877. It's a large part of the 19th century. So what's going on in the 19th century? These, I would say, are the 5 biggest themes that, as a historian, that I would say are essential to understanding what's going on in the 19th century. The first is the Industrial and Transportation Revolution. The world in 1800 was so different than the world of 1900 that it's just difficult to imagine. There is no other period in American or in world history, in human history, where in a 100-year period, the world changed. We think we live in a world of change today. It pales to insignificance when compared to the changes people living in the 19th century experienced. When you think about this, in 1800, the world moved at the speed of a walk. You can gallop your horses for a little while. You can run at a dead run for a little while. You might get a good tailwind on your sailing ship, but by and large, nothing moved faster than 3 or 4 miles an hour anywhere, ever. By 1900, by 1877, you can get on a train and go 50, 60 miles an hour from New York to Chicago, arrive, send a telegraph back, and you people that you left back home know within 5 minutes of your arrival that you're there. Traveling from New York to Chicago in 1800 would have taken you how many weeks? And if you took a wagon with you, how many months? But in 1877, you do it in a day. That, ladies and gentlemen, is change. Going from an iPhone 7 to an iPhone 8 that's not really changed. In fact, having an iPhone isn't that big a deal, because before that you had a telephone. But going from 3 miles an hour to electronic communication via telegraph, that's change. And that's what happened in the 19th century, built around the industrial and transportation revolutions. The second thing is really the rise of a democratic impetus in the world. In 1800, everybody other than in the United States was living in a monarchy. But the consequences of the French Revolution, the American Revolution, brought great change in Western society. And while in 1877, everybody except the United States was still living under a monarchy, the groundswell of democratic movement was everywhere. It was ubiquitous in North, South America, and Europe. In the United States, I think one of the things that's interesting to note is the United States moves from being this kind of aristocratic society, even after the American Revolution, to a remarkably democratic and egalitarian society by mid-century. But I would argue by 1850, that movement had peaked. That the United States in 1850 was the most democratic and most egalitarian it would ever be, assuming you weren't black. And since then, it's kind of gone downhill. The big reason, in my view, is the Industrial Revolution. And by 1850, or after 1850, you certainly start to have a great rise in the disproportionate accumulation of wealth. We started to have very, very wealthy people that had an incredibly disproportionate amount of control over what went on in this country, it starts to begin around 1850 or so. The people of Oakland County are starting to experience that in 1877. Westward migration, of course, is ubiquitous in the United States in the 19th century. We start on the Atlantic seaboard, and by 1850, California is a state. And filling in that is what the 19th century is all about. And of course, coming to Michigan is a part of that. The place of blacks in America is, again, it's ubiquitous. It's everywhere in the 19th century. It doesn't start off that way. For the first 20 years of the 19th century, Americans, by and large, North and South, had their heads in the sand. They were believing that the ideas of the American Revolution and that slavery was morally wrong and destined to extinction still held. That perception was rudely shaken by Missouri's admission as a state in 1819, 1820. Because what became very, very clear is that the South no longer believed that slavery was morally wrong and destined to extinction. In fact, that slavery is morally correct and it should spread all over the country. Well, that caught Northerners by quite a surprise. The net result of that within a decade is the emergence of the anti-slavery movement and abolitionism, which of course leads to the great sectional rivalry that leads to the Civil War, which results in the death of some 650,000 Americans. And then immediately after the Civil War, we move into that period of time when the United States attempted to actually try to figure out a place for blacks in American society. Reconstruction. It failed. And the mark of failure is a withdrawal of troops from the South in the same year this book was written, 1877. And at that point, you clearly have Southern whites reasserting their power over blacks in the form of the Jim Crow laws. And Northern whites basically said, we tried, we give, you win. And they basically abandoned any efforts to have any impact on blacks in the South, really until the 1960s. But these things are sitting there. And then the last thing is the great religious revival that swept through the United States in the early 1800s, known as the Second Great Awakening, which really creates Protestant America that we think of. It's a very different Protestant America than what you had in the colonial era, but it's the Protestant America that we have today. By the 1840s, that movement has kind of run its course, but the end result is that America is this evangelical Protestant country created by the Second Great Awakening. Those are the people that came to Oakland County. Okay. They had, all those pioneers lived through this Second Great Awakening. And it not only is important from a religious perspective, it shapes how Americans view these other four events. Okay. It's from this religious perspective. We'll get into that a little bit later. And then you have a few specific events that you may be familiar with. All of these are occurring in the 1870s. I kind of stopped at 1877 because that's when the book is published. But these are all events that you're probably familiar with that kind of give you little touches of different aspects of American life in the 1870s. One of the things I just want to mention is the Panic of 1873 and the so-called Long Depression that follows that into the 1890s. I'm not sure the depression is quite the right word, but it's clearly a period of deflationary economics. And the people who suffered most from that were farmers, including the farmers here in Oakland County. Which takes us to the next point, if I can push the buttons correctly. Oakland County was a farm county. That's what people did in Oakland County throughout the entire 19th century. We could look at these stats on here, and there's a whole bunch of stats that are kind of interesting when you get a chance to look at it. But I think one of the key things is look at the population figure. I have a clicker. I can point with a magic red dot. Maybe. Turn it on. I'm really good with technology. There you go. There's the population. In 1850, population in the state is 400,000. Oakland County's 31,000. We're the second largest county in the state. By 1860, that population went to 40,000. Oops. Notice the population in 1890, 41,000. Population of Oakland County went flat. The state grew by 600% between 1850 and 1900. Oakland County grew by 30%. It grew 10% between 1860 and 1900. Went flat. Why? Because by 1860, all the land was settled. It was all farmland. And once everybody is farming, it reaches its maximum density. And because there were no cities, there was virtually no manufacturing in Oakland County in this period, how could the population grow? The next generation didn't stay in Oakland County unless they inherited the family farm. They went west, young man, okay? Or, more likely, they went into the cities. That industrial revolution we were talking about, that great urban growth that occurs in the last half of the 19th century, a lot of it is fueled by these farm boys and farm women. They can't stay on the farm in Oakland County, okay? And they don't want to go west, so they go into the city. The point is that this is a flat-out farm community. It becomes fairly diversified farming, lots of different kinds of things going on in the county. It's not like Iowa where everybody's raising corn and you have hundreds of acres of corn. You have relatively small farms and very diversified farming. So why do people come to Michigan? Well, obviously it's the go west young man kind of thing. It's part of this westward migration that I was mentioning earlier, but why Michigan when they came to Michigan? And they came to Michigan when they came for some pretty specific reasons. First of all, the War of 1812 ends, in effect, any kind of resistance on the part of Native Americans to white settlement in this area of the country. We'll talk about that in a bit, but the Native Americans are pretty much smashed here after the War of 1812. They had a bad 60 years, and the game's up after the War of 1812. The other thing that happens is New York, where most of the settlers who come to Michigan come from in this period, Western New York, that land is getting filled up. I've done some work in that area and some research and found that when you look at the rural counties of Western New York, I'm not talking about the county that Buffalo's in or the county that Rochester's in, but the rural counties, they peaked in 1840 and the population remained flat in those counties for 120 years. Doesn't start to grow again until 1960. Why? Well, it's the same thing that happened in Oakland County. They're rural counties. They reach a maximum population density of X in that particular region. And what happens then? Any population growth, the next generation, they leave. In the 1820s and 30s, they left and went west. And where did they come to? Michigan, Northern Ohio, Northern Indiana, Northern Illinois. And then that lines up with transportation changes. In Western New York, obviously the big transportation change is the construction of the Erie Canal, which winds up being one of the premier transportation systems in the world. And it's constructed here in Western New York. It gives New Yorkers access, gives the people of Western New York access to the Great Lakes plus the Atlantic Ocean. And then you take the Erie Canal west to, say, Buffalo, get off and get on a steamship. Not a sailing ship anymore, but steamships. And now you can get from Rochester to Detroit in a week, okay? Maybe 10 days. It'll take you 4 days to get up into Oakland County because the roads are so miserable, but you could at least make that haul from Rochester, New York, say, to Detroit pretty quickly. And then we were talking about this earlier, the Michigan in this period immediately after the War of 1812 was basically regarded as unsettleable land that couldn't be settled. This is a quote from the Surveyor General of the Northwest Territory. There would not be 1 acre in 100 that would in any case admit of cultivation. Well, that's not exactly a ringing endorsement for moving to Michigan. And so in the years immediately following the War of 1812, people didn't come. You had a few. Mostly they were folks who were already here and knew a little bit, and they went north of the swamps, north of Wayne County, In basically where I live, Royal Oak, shoot, when I was a kid growing up, our backyard flooded every time there was a rain. Because it's all swampland down that part of the state, down that part of the county. But you get a little bit north and it turns into the kind of stuff you have up here in Rochester. So this claim of poor land, by the time you get to the mid-20s, is pretty roundly refuted. This is a quote from the Free Press, an article in the Free Press, so it's a little bit of a prejudiced view, but taking into view the price of public land at $1.25 an acre, the quality of the soil, the facility of the market to which will be offered by the New York Erie Canal, the salubrity of the climate, really, and the resources of the country at large, I have never seen a greater inducement to immigration presented, either for the purposes of agriculture or speculation. And basically that's what happens, is this is the view that becomes commonly held about Michigan after mid-20s. Now, the Great Migration to Michigan doesn't really pick up until you get into the mid-30s. That's Michigan fever. That's when the more people were coming to Michigan in the mid-1830s than any place else in the country. But from the mid-20s on to the mid-30s, there's a pretty substantial migration into Michigan, and then it just explodes in 35, 36, 37. Now, when they came here, they came here to buy land. The land in the United States, except the original 13 colonies, Kentucky and Tennessee, because they wound up getting settled early, and Texas, all of the land in the United States is sold by virtue of the Northwest Ordinance that was written in 1787. The Northwest Ordinance basically laid out how the land was going to be surveyed and essentially how it was going to be sold. Many of you will be familiar with the story, but I think it's important because in the book, you are going to continually see references to what we're going to talk about. Each area of the country was broken into, there were two lines that were arbitrary lines that were created for every section of the country, not every state or town or territory, but every kind of region. One was a baseline that ran east-west. In Michigan, what do we call that baseline in this area? That's 8 Mile Road. The baseline runs all the way across the state. 8 Mile Road doesn't, but the baseline runs all the way across the state. And then that's intersected by a meridian, a north-south line. You can see on the map where those two lines intersect. It's up here northwest of Jackson a little bit. That's where those two lines intersect. Surveyors went out into the woods, they identified that spot, and then they started surveying. 3 guys would go out into the woods. They'd have something like that tripod with a surveyor's compass on it. One guy would hold a stick with a 66-foot chain on it. Another guy would walk down 66 feet until that chain ended. They'd stick it in the ground. The surveyor, the guy looking at the instrument, would say, well, move left, move right. Okay, good, put a mark there. And then they'd move down. And they'd keep moving. And once they had moved 80 chain lengths, they have covered a mile. And they take a stake and put it in the ground. They started here. That's at the intersection of that meridian and baseline. And they moved east and put a stake in the ground right here. And then they move another mile, put another stake in the ground. Put some words on it so you know what they're doing. And here, and here, and here, and here. And then they have to come back and do it here and here. And when they get done, they've got like 49 stakes in the ground marking the intersection of these section lines, these sections. The Northwest Ordinance created townships. Those townships were 6 miles by 6 miles. They're broken into these grids, these sections, they're called sections, of 1 mile square. That same process is used all over the country. And so when you went to buy land, what would happen is the likelihood is you probably went out into the wilderness. Now remember, this is flat out wilderness, okay? Original growth timber, it's nature, right? There's nothing here that has changed that. And so you go out in the woods and you find a bit of land that you think is going to be good farmland for you, and you go find these stakes stuck in the ground, figure out whether you are in what township you're in. So the townships were measured by like 3 townships north, range 4 east. That's that township. And that would be marked on these stakes. And then it would tell you what section you're at. Okay? And you say, well, here's where I am. I'm right here. Okay? Based on these stakes you find in the ground, and you go back to the land office in Detroit and say, okay, I want to buy land. I want to buy the northeast 1/4. Now, these are 1 square mile sections, 640 acres. Too big for anybody to buy. The quarter sections will be 160 acres. Too big for most people to buy. So you'd go out there and you'd find this bit of land, and it would be the northeast quarter of the northeast quarter of section 7. And you'd figure that out by looking at these stakes in the ground. Then you go back to the land office in Detroit and give them your money. And now it's yours. Okay. Everybody had to do that. Right? That's how you bought your land. Now, the land itself was actually sold in accordance to the Land Act of 1820, at least most of the land in Michigan. The land was sold at $1.25 an acre. You had to pay cash, and you had to buy a minimum of 80 acres. So for 100 acres, or for $100, you can get an 80-acre farm. When you look at the plat maps of Oakland County, you're going to see a huge number of 80-acre chunks of 80-acre farms. Now, before the Land Act of 1820, which didn't cover that big of a period for Oakland County's purposes, once the land was surveyed, it was open up for sale at auction. The land was sold for, it was sold at auction, and then whatever wasn't sold at the auction would be open to the public at $2 an acre. You had to buy at least 160 acres, and you could buy it by putting 25% down. The early provision opened this up to speculators. The later provision, the Land Act of 1820, made it more suitable for individual farmers. Okay, you didn't need as much money. And then there are a couple of other bits of legislation that come up later, the Preemption Act in 1830 and the Homestead Act in 1862 that you're probably familiar with. All three of these are steps in the direction of creating America as a more egalitarian society, giving individuals the ability to get land. Okay, that's a big step in the direction, again, of creating this egalitarian society in America. And so once you get the land surveyed, this is what you have. A county, and all these thin black lines are basically section lines. There are also mile roads. The Northwest Ordinance required, or at least in the state of Michigan, section lines were mandated as public highways. So all of those section lines became roads, so long as the terrain permitted it. Okay, you're going to get, in this county, a lot of lakes. In other cases, other natural features that prohibit that. Another thing about the county in the early days is that the townships that are laid out are survey townships. That is mandated by federal law. You have to do that. But those townships do not have to become governmental units. In Michigan and many states, those townships did become governmental units, but they didn't have to be. So Avon Township doesn't have to be a governmental unit at all, but it did. That's what happened in Michigan. And initially, there were two governmental units in Oakland County, Oakland Township and Bloomfield Township, in the very early days. By 1837, all of these survey townships had been formally established as governmental townships. One other thing I should mention about the Northwest Ordinance is Section 16 of every township. The money raised from the sale of land in that township went into a public school fund, and that money was to be used for schools. That becomes important in a minute. Now, where did these people come from? Well, mostly they came from Western New York. The migration pattern was basically in the 1790s, people moved out of Western New England into Western New York. They skipped the Hudson River Valley because that was already settled during the colonial period. And they moved into Western New York because that land was being sold up by the Iroquois nation. The Iroquois had gotten thumped in the Revolutionary War, and by 1790, they're pretty much forced to sell up, and they did. And as they sold up, settlers came into Western New York from New England. Old stock Puritans, whose ancestry goes back into the 1600s. They're the ones that settled in Western New York primarily. That's supplemented by people moving up a little bit from Pennsylvania, a little bit from New Jersey, coming in from England or Scotland, a few other states. But mostly what happened is people moved into Western New York, and then in the 1820s, 30s, 40s, they left New York and came to Northern Ohio, Northern Indiana, Northern Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Okay. You certainly had people coming directly to Michigan from New England or Pennsylvania, but the majority of this is go into Western New York and then come west to Michigan. One of these days, I'm going to sit down with this map, a bigger version of it, with a bunch of little dots, and I'm going to go through this book again, and I'm going to put dots in the counties in Oakland County, or in New York, where these people came from. Just trying to demonstrate the concentration of people from New York. There's just a section here that lists the early doctors that came here, and I just want to read a section of this. Dr. Sterling, one of the early pioneer physicians, moved to Oakland County from Monroe County in New York. It's up near Rochester. Dr. Olmsted came from Lewiston, New York. Dr. John Chamberlain came from near Auburn, New York. Ezra Park, a native of Connecticut, and brother of Captain Harvey Park, who's actually a surveyor and has a great bit in the book, came to Bloomfield from Onondaga County in New York. Born in Connecticut, moves to Onondaga, and then comes to Michigan. Cyrus Chapman came to Avon Township in 1821, originally from Vermont, and originally from Vermont. It doesn't say whether he went to New York, but he's from Vermont originally and then comes to Michigan. Ezekiel Webb of Farmington was a Quaker. He came from Farmington, New York. Dr. J.C. Emery came to Novi from Seneca County, New York. And on it goes. On it goes. Of all of these doctors, the first doctors coming to Oakland County. And if you look at each of the individual townships, you're going to get something like this. It won't necessarily be in every township this 100% or heavy percentage of folks out of Western New York. You'll get sections where there's quite a few people come from New Jersey, or quite a few people coming from Pennsylvania, or some from England, or some from Scotland. So you get occasionally these concentrations from other areas, but pretty much it's New York, Western New York. The journey west. Everybody had to get here. So this is from one of your Avon Township residents, a guy by the name of Jonathan Pixley. I was born in 1799 in the township and county of Tioga in the state of New York. I lived there until March of 1823, when with my family I moved to Monroe County, Western New York. I lived there 8 years, when in company with my late brother emigrated to Michigan. We started from Brockport on the Erie Canal. Brockport's a bit west of Rochester. On Thursday, the 12th of May, 1831, and arrived in Buffalo the Saturday following. We stayed there until Monday morning, when we shipped aboard a steamer, the William Penn. Notice they didn't travel on Sunday. After a very rough voyage, we arrived in Detroit on the 20th at about 4 o'clock. We put up at the Old Yankee boarding house. After breakfast, I put out to find a yoke of oxen. I soon found some for $65, went to a shop and bought a yoke for them, and driving down to the dock, hitched them up to my wagon. He'd apparently brought his wagon on the canal boat, and then put it on a steamer and brought it to Detroit, and then hooked up the oxen to haul it off the boat. I went back up to the tavern, picked up my family, and started for Oakland. The mud was hub deep, and I had to walk by my oxen's head, for I did not know what caper they might get up to. We came to what is now called 4 Mile House the first night, and they stayed there, and then the next morning they continued north. At around lunchtime, at noon, we arrived at a place then called Mother Hansom's. Mother Handsome shows up in a lot of these stories. She ran kind of an inn tavern place, basically 10 Mile and Woodward in Royal Oak. She was apparently quite a piece of work, and took dinner there, but had nothing for my oxen. I told the old lady that we were not very hungry, but wanted a good cup of tea. She said, "By God, you shall have it." We got it, and so strong it was, I didn't know whether it was herb tea or what. After dinner, we started from there, and further on came to Chase's Corner. on the Crooks Road. This is 13 Mile and Crooks in Royal Oak. That's Chase's Corner. He let me turn out my oxen into bait, into his field to eat. They ate up what was there in a hurry. I bought a bushel of potatoes and started on. Our next stopping place was at Mrs. Guy Phelps in Troy. It being Saturday night, we stayed there until Monday morning when we took an early start for our home. Notice again, he doesn't travel on Sunday. Why is that? It's the day of rest. It's the Sabbath. These are very religious people. Right? Second Great Awakening. All right? Got as far as Benjamin Horton's, where we took dinner, after which we resumed our journey at our present and arrived at our present home on the northeast quarter of Section 23 in Avon Township on the 23rd of May. Nothing occurred during the summer worthy of any note, right? Different standard of anything of note until the 12th of September, when all but myself was taken sick with typhoid fever. This was a great drawback for us, but I had a good and kind neighbors for which I shall always be thankful. That's one guy's journey here, and you can read, 100 very similar to that in the book. Now, the trek was usually the one that's described here. You take the Erie Canal out to Buffalo, you get on a steamship, you come to Detroit, you get a wagon, and you head north through the mud until you get north of Royal Oak, when things get to be a little bit better, and then you kind of bounce your way to wherever your plot of land is. Many of these guys came out 1 year, found their land, bought it, went home, packed up the family, and came back the next year. That will show up a lot of times. When they got here, in most of these places, you're going to have a reasonable representation of Native Americans, not densely populated. My guess is not here all year round, but most of these townships, you're going to find stories about Native Americans. And they're pretty much like this most of the time. The Indians were usually very quiet and peaceable, and for a number of years after the first settlements were made, hunted and fished around the beautiful lake. This is White Lake. Undoubtedly, they were much grieved when the time came for them to be removed from its locality. The comments on the Native Americans are usually very positive. You're going to get, in many cases, some kind of snide remark about they drank too much. They were indolent, lazy. They would pilfer. They were indolent. I guess I look at that and say, you get these people coming out, chopping down trees and kind of carving civilization in the wilderness. The Native Americans were one with nature. The Americans were doing battle with it. Okay, so the term indolent is a little bit interesting and tells you more, I think, the perspective of whites than it does about anything about the Native Americans. Michigan became a dry state in 1854. They didn't become a dry state because you had all of these temperance advocates worried about whether or not the Indians were going to be drinking. They were worried about whether whites were drinking. So the comment about Indians and drinking, you kind of have to take that a little bit, in my mind, with a grain of salt, because there's so much temperance activity that kind of condemned any kind of drinking, that, okay, if the Indians drank, they're going to get condemned. But you know what? They were condemning whites for drinking too. And the whole business of this petty thievery, it's never anything major. It seems, as I've read in various places, that the Indians had a fairly liberal view of who owned food. And so they may show up in your cabin some night if the door is open and kind of take some bread. They wouldn't even think of it as being stealing. But most of the comments on the Native Americans is very, very favorable. They were honest. We got along with them just fine. Again, there's a few little incidents in here, but not many. But what happens here is by 1840, you stop reading anything about the Native Americans. And one of the reasons is in 1830. Well, the first reason is that the treaties that were signed basically gave the Native Americans to remain in place until the land was needed for settlement, and then they had to move. So they're here in Oakland County by virtue, and whites are moving into this area by virtue of a treaty signed in 1807. So long as there weren't any whites in the area and their land wasn't being occupied, then the Indians stayed and could stay. But it's when the land all gets sold up, now they have to leave. So that's one thing that's going on. The second thing that's going on in 1830 is the Indian Removal Act is passed. And what that did by law was Indians were to move west of the Mississippi. All Indians east of the Mississippi were to move west of the Mississippi. This is the infamous Trail of Tears story. Now, the fact is that Michigan did not really have a Trail of Tears experience. You did have some Indians in a few, 500-600 Indians in a Potawatomi reservation or a group out near Kalamazoo. They did get caught up in the forced removal and forced march west. But there were about 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 Indians in Michigan at the time. 90% of those Indians went north. Of their own volition, I suspect, to simply get out of the way of this removal. But they removed themselves from this area and went north. Only a pretty small handful of Native Americans in Michigan were forcibly removed. The vast majority went north, and essentially they hid out for the next 15, 20 years in the north. They got out of the way of white settlement and avoided forced removal by moving north. This happened in Michigan, happened in Wisconsin. They moved up into the North Woods, where there really wasn't any interest in taking over their land. In 1850, the legislature of Michigan petitioned Congress to allow the Native Americans that were here to remain. And by the middle 1850s, the federal government basically kind of said, okay, we're done with this Indian removal stuff. By that time, some 400,000 Indians had been moved west of the Mississippi. There were 18,000 roughly remaining east of the Mississippi. 7,000 or 8,000 of them were in Michigan. But they weren't here. They moved north. And so it was kind of not quite the Indian removal that you think of, but they did move north. And they did so, my guess, is to get out of the way of white migration. The Potawatomi out near Kalamazoo, they didn't go north and they got caught up in the sweep and were forced west. One of the things that's kind of interesting, well, this is a great quote. In Pontiac and Auburn, sickness was the greatest obstacle which settlers had to encounter. Many families buried all their children of the dreadful fevers, and many children lost both parents and had to be sent to their friends in the East. That's about the only quote like that I found in the book. Right? There is very little about any direct kind of statements about how unhealthy it was. And it doesn't make sense to me, right? And I started to think about it. So why? Well, I think what it really comes down to is they expected this. They expected to die often of disease. They expected to be hit heavily by disease. You know, it's kind of a casual mention in that one article about typhoid fever. Yeah, so everybody got sick with typhoid fever. Now, we made it through okay, and we're all right, thanks to our neighbors. And you'll get those kinds of statements, but not very many of them. What you do see, though, are things a lot like this. The fruits of this marriage have been a family of 13 children, of whom 10 are still living. That phrasing, you can pull out the numbers and then change it. But whenever somebody talks about the family of 5 kids and 4 are still surviving, or 3 are surviving, or all are still surviving. But there's always this kind of hook, not always, but a vast majority of the time, there's this little hook at the end of the statement of how many kids you have as how many are surviving. Well, why? Because the death rate for kids was roughly 16% in 1870. I don't know what it would have been in 1830. But the death rate of children born in 1870 was about 16%. And the number of dead mothers in childbirth was also pretty scary high. Now, if you only had 1 kid, the odds weren't that terrible. But when you had 8 or 10 kids, the odds of a woman dying in childbirth are now starting to move in the neighborhood of 8, 9, 10%. And so that kind of gets to another thing that's kind of, I think, indicative of the condition of the health condition in Oakland County in the 18th and 19th century. The remarriage rate. Bob married Sally. They had 5 kids, and then Sally died, and in 1839, and then in 1840, Bob remarried. Okay, the remarriage happens like within 6 to 12 months, almost all the time. Why? Necessity. Exactly right. This was a business arrangement. Now, they may have got along okay, but maybe it explains why the Buttons didn't look all that cheery. They married because it was kind of a necessity. The couple made this thing work. There's really what I think is a pretty interesting quote. This guy who comes west with his family, and then I think his dad dies, then his mother dies. Sometime after the death of my mother, I began to see the need of a helpmate, and married Miss Mary Ann Wright. Why? Because they want the helpmate. They want the partner. That it takes 2 to make this thing work, and especially if you have kids left over from, of the 13, 10 are still alive. Well, somebody's got to help with that, and then you have to go have another 13 kids, of course. But those are kind of indicative. Now, there's plenty of disease, and you're going to see some reference to some of those disease. And these guys had to tackle things like the measles and mumps. There was a huge cholera epidemic in Detroit in 1832, another one that swept through not so bad in 1840. They're not mentioned at all in here. You see a couple of mentions of smallpox and people getting quarantined in Pontiac. But the one thing that you will see a lot of is the reference to mosquitoes and the reference to fever and ague. Fever and ague is malaria. You'll see continual references to fever and ague, and you will see continual references to mosquitoes. We came to what is known as the 4-mile house. We stayed all night, but little sleep did we get, for the mosquitoes were determined to have their fill. And you're going to see these little snippets continually in these oral histories and these biographies as they go through their day. Somebody makes the crack about the mosquitoes. Okay, and another thing that's kind of interesting is these mill ponds that were built became havens for the mosquitoes and havens for disease. Here's one they're talking about up in Waterford. There's a great story in here, at least I think it's a great story. Well, I'm not going to find it. In Milford, there was this guy had a mill pond, and for a number of years, they're talking about the people who lived in the area didn't like it because they would get sick. And so one day, while this guy was down in Ohio and his wife was left tending the mill and the dam, the brave souls from Milford showed up with their wagons and horses, and they tore the dam down. And basically the woman comes out and says, I'm going to take your name and turn them in. They said, go ahead. We don't care. We've been fighting this thing forever. Take our names. See what happens. And nothing happened. They tore the dam down. And the mill pond, of course, goes away. But again, the reason that's the problem is, of course, mosquitoes in this stagnant water and fever and ague, which is essentially malaria. So you'll see a lot of that. You don't see too much of anything else. Now, the mills themselves are, again, ubiquitous. They're everywhere. Every little township, you're going to wind up reading about, 4, 5, 6 mills that get constructed in this period. Rochester is a perfect example. There's a map of Rochester. I don't know whether you can see it, but Rochester, of course, with Paint Creek and the Clinton River here, was a great center of mills. Okay, so there's on this map you can find 7 or 8 mills if you look carefully, or where they once were. They may have been gone. This is 1910, I think, or thereabouts. But the thing about these mills is invariably what you're going to find is the first mill is a sawmill. Okay, I didn't see any evidence of these being sawmills and taking the lumber and shipping them east to Buffalo or to Detroit. It appears as though, this is all forested land. When the settlers came in here, they had to chop down all the trees, and then they had to build a lot of houses, a lot of barns, and a lot of fences. And I think that's what these sawmills are for. It doesn't look like they were being used to produce lumber that they're going to sell back east, which is what happened in northern Michigan, of course. Buffalo was built, New York to a certain extent is built with lumber from Michigan. So you see the sawmills, and then after the sawmills, you'll see grist mills. And then you start to see, and in some cases pretty early, Paint Creek talks about having a woolen mill in the 1820s. Well, why? Because we wound up raising a lot of sheep in this county, in this state. Michigan was the 4th leading producer of sheep and wool in the country. And Oakland County was one of the leading sheep producers in the state, okay? Like 1st, 2nd, 3rd for most of this period. So there's a lot of sheep here, a lot of wool, and so these woolen mills start to come in. Carding mills, fulling mills, and then a few like here in Rochester where they're actually making something, gloves. There's a glove factory in Pontiac too later. And then you get to the cider mills. As Oakland County becomes more diversified, Oakland County becomes very much a vegetable center or a fruit center. Lots of apple trees here, cherry trees, pear trees, a lot of that, but mostly apples, and that leads you to the cider mills. We come by these cider mills quite honestly. It was a central part of the economy here in Oakland County for a long time. And then you get plaster mills, foundries. What are plaster mills for? What's the plaster for? Nope, it's fertilizer. I thought it was walls too for years. And then I just was poking around on it one time, 10 years ago, and it turns out that the plaster was fertilizer. Ground, well, there are 3 possibilities: ground limestone, ground gypsum, and the byproduct of potash that is basically ashes from fires. And then you would use that to kind of convert it into fertilizer. Fires, the mills themselves were, you talked about being them water mills, and that certainly was the way they were initially. But as early as 1830, Royal Oak doesn't have any water, any running water anyhow. So the first mills in Royal Oak were steam mills, steam engines. There was a sawmill that they put up in Royal Oak to help cut railroad ties for the first railroad running up essentially alongside Woodward Avenue in the early 1830s. It was a steam mill. The Industrial Revolution has arrived, okay? Now, what happens is there's quite a few steam mills that you're gonna run across here. In some cases, they're like Royal Oak, where it's a standalone steam mill. In more cases, however, it's a supplemental power source for when the water runs dry at certain times of the season, certain times of the year. So they have a backup system. Fires wind up being a pretty standard thing that's going to happen to a lot of these mills. And you think, well, it's these steam mills, of course, steam engines that burst into flames. And, that was true. But the fact is, flour mills, grist mills, sawmills with sawdust, woolen mills with that woolen fiber in the air, fine dust particles in the air, that stuff is very flammable, even explosive. And so whether or not you were running water power or a steam mill, the chances of fire in one of these mills is pretty high. Fire in these towns, of course, was fairly high. Lake Orion, or Orion as it was called then, I think burned to the ground 3 times. Farmington had a huge fire. Pontiac had a huge fire. So everything was made of wood, right? Schools. You're going to see this quote in virtually every township. The first school taught was in the loft of Major Williams' sheep house, or in somebody's barn, or in an empty shed, and that's where the first school was. In the fall of 1821, the teacher was a man named Brett. There's a fair chance that Brett, and I don't know this for a fact, but there's a fair chance that Brett had moved here as a young man, maybe with his family. He's trying to get money so he can buy land at $1.25 an acre. So he teaches school for the winter, sacks away some money, and then goes by to 80 acres. Maybe he bought it in Oakland County, maybe he bought it somewhere else. But that's probably what Brett was doing, was working as a teacher for the winter so that he could earn enough money to buy his own land. The first schoolhouse was built in the Williams settlement in 1822. The school was taught by Miss Stevens with 12 pupils. The house was built of logs.
What does that mean that it was in the Williams settlement?
Yeah. Yeah, well, Oliver Williams was one of the very early settlers in Oakland County. He moved into what becomes Waterford Township. And so the settlement kind of builds up around Williams. We call that, Waterford, right? Another quote that you're going to see quite a bit of is male teachers are employed for the winter term and females for the summer term. The salaries of the former being generally $45 a month. When you cut to the chase, the female salary is about half that. Okay. Why were men running the schools in the winter and women running the schools in the summer? Yeah, not the men who were teaching school. The young men who were going to school went out on the farms in the summer. The 13, the 14, the 15-year-old boys were working the farms in the summer. And so women could handle the smaller kids. But in the winter, when these young thugs came to school, you needed somebody with a large stick to wrap them upside the head every couple of minutes to keep order. Now, the difference in pay is simply, we're going to hose the women here. That's what's going to come back to. Now, there were territorial laws governing schools, but by and large, this stuff didn't have much of an impact. It was these little schools that wind up getting created by local settlers at their own initiative. And why were they creating these schools? Well, they're old stock Puritans, and their kids need to learn to read. Why is it so important for them to learn to read? Read the Bible. These are a very religious bunch. This is the Second Great Awakening. They need to be able to read the Bible, and hence these schools. The big thing for schools in Michigan comes when Michigan becomes a state. The Constitution was written in 1835. Isaac Crary, who was a lawyer from Marshall, was the prime mover behind this, but he was ably supported by Reverend John D. Pierce, who was a minister that was sent out by the Home Missionary Society to Marshall, and they put together basically the Michigan provisions in the Constitution, and then Crary becomes the first representative to Washington from the state of Michigan, and John Pierce becomes the first state superintendent of schools, which is in fact one of the big things about what happened in Michigan, is that the state wound up being the pinnacle of the school system, not the townships. And Michigan had a state superintendent. Yeah, but it starts here. And it's the first state that had a state superintendent. Okay, how many have ever heard of Horace Mann? You know, he's kind of the founder, credited with being the father of public schools in America. Horace Mann's work was done a couple of years after Pierce and Crary did theirs. It's first here in Michigan, but Michigan is such a small state, we didn't get any credit for it. But the creation of a systematic state school system comes from Crary and Pierce. A couple of things that are important here is that, first of all, it's a comprehensive system. University of Michigan is a part of that system. The idea was from primary education up to college, you're going to have a school system in Michigan. One of the things that Pierce did was to create academies. There were 7 or 8 of them in the state. These are essentially high schools. Now remember, this is a time when every school in this state is a one-room schoolhouse. But Pierce creates these academies that are more or less like high schools. The purpose of these schools was to create scholars to go to Ann Arbor, to the university, but also to train teachers, okay? And to serve as an agricultural school. This is the rise of science, scientific farming. So we're going to have schools for agriculture. Now, the problem with all of this is that the Panic of 1837 and the subsequent Depression meant that the state couldn't fund this stuff. And so they backed away from these academies fairly quickly. But in 1849, there's a teachers' college that is established in OG. Where was that again? Ypsilanti. And Michigan Normal School becomes Eastern Michigan University. It's a teachers' college. And then in 1855, there's an agricultural school created up in, where was that again? You know, East Lansing, Michigan State University. And all of this is kind of from the Crary Pierce sort of plan. The other thing that was really important about this is that money from Section 16 went to the state. It stopped getting distributed to the individual townships and wound up being collected and went into a central pool in land or in the state. And that provided the funding for some of these activities that were being done. It would be doled out to the townships based on population. it gave the state some leverage in having some control over how the schools were established. So there's a whole bunch more that I can talk about that I'll never be able to get to. So we're going to kind of skip a lot of this and get to one of the kind of interesting bits in here. My goodness, I missed a lot. And that is, I want to spend some time looking at some of these lithographs that appear in the book. There's, I don't know, 100, 120 lithographs of farmsteads in the county. And they're really quite interesting. And what I want to do is spend a little bit of time getting you to look carefully at some of these images. Again, this is the Windy 8 farm. It's up in Waterford. You can see on the map roughly where it's at. That's Waterford, so it's up in the north. Windy 8 would have had to pay to have this drawing done and then converted into a lithograph and included in the book. So what do you see here? There's a train, okay? Industrial Revolution, Transportation Revolution. Windy 8 wants that train in this image of his farm. He's on that railroad track. That gives him a good market advantage. So that's certainly there. You're going to find at least railroad tracks, and in a few cases, train engines going through the front of these pictures. Okay. Yeah, there's telegraph poles. That's a good point. Telegraph poles. What else? Well, it's not an oil well. What is it? Yeah, it's a water pump, a windmill, bringing water up. Again, this would be, I think, an indication of, again, the Industrial Revolution. This isn't something Windy 8 made in his house. This is something he manufactured or was manufactured somewhere else. Maybe it comes as a kit or something, but he didn't make that by himself. What else? What else do you see? Pardon? Cattle and horses. And one of the interesting things is almost all these pictures, the horses will be up at the front, and there'll be these lovely looking steeds that look like they belong on some Kentucky bluegrass farm. They're beautiful looking animals. Everybody wants their horse to look really good. Besides horse and cattle, what else do you see over there? Kids. All right. They're not sheep, by the way. They're hogs. When you look carefully, these are pigs, hogs. And then you see some kids over here playing with the hoop. All right. Look carefully. What else do you see? Yeah, the number of outbuildings, you're going to see a lot of outbuildings in most of these.
It looks like he's using some technology for his farming too, right behind that.
But here?
Yeah, I can't see over there.
Yeah, it's hard to know sometimes, especially in this kind of thing. Notice the lake back here, right? Getting this, did anybody see what's going on here? 2 people. What are they doing? They can. They're playing croquet. You wouldn't believe the number of images of people playing croquet on these lawns in these pictures. Of the 120, I'll bet 30, 40 of them maybe have people playing croquet. It's quite interesting.
The original Hollywood sign says the name.
One of the things that I didn't mention right at the beginning, but I should have, when I threw up the title page, it's the History of Oakland County, Michigan, with illustrations, descriptions of its scenery, palatial residences, public buildings, fine blocks, and important manufacturers. Those are the pictures. How palatial is the estate here? A house is pretty ordinary, right? Yep.
There's add-ons to his house. He's got a large thing.
Yeah, probably. But it's not a big house. No, this is just a wing and upright, or upright and wing, or whatever they call them.
If you could compare that with the actual.
Well, that's one of the nice things about these pictures is that there's a fair number of these homes that are still around. And when you do compare them, the drawings are very, very close to what they look like today. There's some dispute as to whether the outbuildings are comparable to what they were, because those outbuildings got torn down, so we don't have any real record of those. But I was actually talking to some people last week, and we had this book and we were looking at their home, which is in the book. They said the home looks just like this. That outbuilding right there, we moved that from that location to behind our house. And the foundation for that building is still there. So who knows? I mean, there just isn't enough real good data to say how accurate the outbuildings are. But there's enough pretty good anecdotal evidence that would lead you to believe that the descriptions of the houses, the pictures of the houses are pretty accurate.
What else was fascinating is the trees that have grown up around those properties. I grew up in one we came on Township, and the black walnut trees.
That are there today. And when you look at these pictures, there are any I mean, remember, this was a forest, a deep woods, primal, first growth forest. All those trees are gone.
Can't farm.
You can't farm with the trees there, so you clear out the trees, right? And now what's happened, you look at pictures of Oakland County in 1900 and compare it to pictures today. In 1900, there's no trees, and now there are trees all over the place. Because they clear cut it.
What date when you estimate this to?
The book was produced in 1877. The drawing was probably done sometime in the summer of 1877. What do you notice here?
A lot of trees.
A lot of trees. What kind of trees? It's an orchard, right? Remember what I talked about, the farms becoming more diversified, the importance of fruit growth? Well, you're going to see stuff like this in a lot of these books. But it's not just an orchard, okay? There's wheat maybe going on here. So it's not, these guys are not one-trick ponies, typically. That's exactly right. What else do you see? A lot of fences. And notice what these fences are back here. What kind of fence? You know, there's split rail fences out there, right? And then up along the barn and up here, they're nicer. Now, whether or not those fences really looked that nice in 1877, or they're gussied up for purposes of the photo or of the lithograph, you know, you can use your own judgment. I can tell you none of these farms were nearly as tidy as that. I'm pretty sure of that. But the basic structure probably isn't bad. What else do you notice? There they are. See them playing croquet?
Oh, yeah.
Right here.
I'm trying to give you a impression of a well-maintained road too.
Yeah. Yeah, the road didn't look like this.
I'm not sure, but can you point out the outhouse or did they have indoor plumbing?
That's an interesting point that I hadn't thought about until a few days ago. Somebody pointed out, you won't find any outhouses in these pictures.
I think there is one.
You know, I think there was too, but it's kind of hidden behind a tree. Yeah. It looked a little big for an outhouse, but it could have been a three-holer. You know. But generally speaking, you're going to look long and hard to find an outhouse in any of these pictures.
One thing I've noticed in these pictures I've seen in other books is they give kind of a gentility to the farm area, you know,
Mhm.
very genteel.
Yeah.
Fine.
Yeah, exactly right. Again, these are folks that could afford to do this. I mean, you look at the house. This is not a mansion, okay? These guys obviously got a good farm. He's got some acreage. He can afford to get his name in the book. So he's not poor, but he's not a wealthy man.
I disagree. Look at his farms and the storage areas. They're bigger than his house by one.
You're going to see that in every single picture. The number of outbuildings in these pictures it's incredible, really, when you think about it. That's exactly right. Pardon?
They weren't into big houses. They had enough house for their family.
When you have 10 kids?
Ah,
Here's an example. This is one just on the, looks to me like it's a very small plot of land. This guy obviously isn't running a farm. But that's a nice house, right? What do you notice here?
There's a horse and a carriage.
Yeah.
That actually looks like a village to be on Adams Road.
Yeah.
I'm actually looking at the croquet.
Yeah. Good luck. I don't think there's croquet. Oh, there they are. It's amazing. See this little girl over here? Sitting on the steps? What's the steps for? You don't have to carry it. Notice the condition of this road.
That's more paved.
Pardon?
It's more paved.
Actually, I think those are ruts. Okay? They're ruts that kind of indicate a little bit better the condition of roads in this era. We could get into a great story about the roads, but they were terrible. They were terrible. Not by comparison. Come rainy season, these roads wound up being virtually impassable. So 2, 3, 4 months a year you couldn't ride on. So we could go on. There's lots of these, 120 of these in the book. You can look at it in the library. You can look at it online, but look carefully. See what's there and start to pick that out and put it in the context of what's going on, not just in Oakland County. The great value of local history is not that it's special. It's that it's typical. It's representative of what's going on in the United States, in the world. It's not unique to Avon Township or Rochester or Oakland County or Michigan. That's the great value of local history, but you have to kind of think about that from that larger perspective.
Where do you find it online?
Type in Oakland County history, maybe you put in Everett, so you can make it public. All right? So that's my story. We're going to wrap it up here.
If you gave a book to each of the libraries, how many libraries are there in Oakland County?
There were 35 libraries, and I contacted 32 of them wanted the book, 3 didn't respond. Yeah. Now, I think I may have missed West Bloomfield. Turns out I missed the library. Hopefully I have one book extra.
Can you purchase those books?
You can. The publisher is Higginson Publishing. They'll cost about, for this book, would be $76 if you bought it direct plus shipping.
My son goes to OU, he's gonna be a teacher, and he loves history.
Yeah, yeah.
It's great for him.
It is.
Yeah.
And especially when you look at it for a teacher, again, this is somewhat like primary source material. It's not really primary source material, but it's close to it. And for students to go in and dig around in this stuff and kind of form their own generalizations, I think is a great exercise. Other questions?
How many farms in 1877 were there, and how many farms are there?
I can't tell you, I have seen that number, you can find that stuff in the census. So it's there, but I don't know. I don't know, I mean, I have seen it for 1870, 1880, that kind of stuff. I haven't seen it for sure.
It should be easy to get a list of Centennial farms.
Yeah. Then you probably would be too difficult, actually. Then you probably look up online for you.
Now you know why those roads are so important to the automobile.
Yeah.
The automobile came to Oakland County, they had to do something about those roads.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. Have a good evening. Thanks for your interest.